It's time for the show about the people and the places of the Carolinas with the occasional visitors. In addition to hosting the award-winning syndicated TV show Life in the Carolinas, Carl White writes a weekly syndicated column and now hosts this weekly show, the Life in the Carolinas podcast. Now you can hear the story about the stories. And now, here's your host, Carl White.
Larry Baity, it's awfully good to see you.
Well, good morning, Carl. Pleased to be here.
You know, my goodness, we met some years ago through a mutual friend and have been working together on a project. And we're not going to get into all that because it's such a massive project. But I do want you to share a little bit about yourself because, Larry, you've been on Earth quite a while and you've done a lot of things. But before we get into your memories around the racetrack, which go way back, let's tell folk a little bit about you. Where were you born, and a little bit about your folks?
Well, I'm a mountain boy.
Yeah.
Born in Wilkes County in a little community called Oakwoods. About a 10-minute drive out of Wilkesboro, or North Wilkesboro, near the foothills of the Brushy Mountains. And I was born on March 16th, 1935, a long time ago,
Right.
on a very cold Saturday night.
Right.
And a little story. You know, Carl, and I haven't been with me for a while. You know, if I talk with you more than 5 minutes, you're going to get a story.
At
right?
least one, maybe two.
But it seems I was told many years later that I was anticipated to be born that evening. It was a Saturday evening, waiting for the Grand Ole Opry to come on. And in those days, people would listen to the Grand Ole Opry on Saturday evenings.
Wait a minute. Are you telling me that your birth was to be synchronized with the time of the coming on of the Grand Ole Opry?
They hope not. They wanted me to arrive much earlier.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
All right. So they want you to come in the morning so they could be back home or be there for the Grand Ole Opry sitting around the, around the radio, right?
Yeah, because in those days they listened to old Philco's or Zenith radios. And
right.
I was running late, I was told, and the Grand Ole Opry was getting ready to come on, and I came on, or was birthed. And I didn't even produce a whimper, I'm told, during the whole show.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's what I was told.
Oh, my goodness.
But I became a very talkative little boy much later.
I'm sure your mother was vocal during the process.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, that's great. So born. Wow, could we say Larry Baity was born on the Grand Ole Opry?
Not quite. Just about an hour before.
Yeah.
But
certainly influenced. That's a wonderful story. So born in North Carolina in Wilkes County, largest county by landmass in the state.
Yeah.
So that maybe that has something to do with your personality. So you were born in the Carolinas, but then you decided to do a bit of traveling as you got older, right?
Well, when I graduated from high school, it's during the Korean War. And so rather than digging foxholes in the frozen tundra of North Korea, I chose to join the Air Force.
Okay.
I always had a love affair with silver-winged aircraft.
Right.
And so I went to the Air Force, served 4 tours from 1953 through 1957.
Oh, where'd you do your training?
Lackland Air Force Base.
Okay.
San Antonio.
Right.
Quite an experience for a kid from North Carolina who'd only been out of the county three times in his life.
Right.
Well, out of the state 3 times, out of the county maybe 6 times.
Right.
But quite an experience for a kid who'd grown up as a mountain boy.
Wow. What are some of those memories during that time that you're comfortable talking about?
Well, there'd be numerous ones. I learned I was stationed at Pine Castle Air Force Base down in outside Orlando. And my major tour duty was a Strategic Air Command Air Force Base with B-47 jet bombers, which was the first swept-back wing jet bomber that was designed to carry the atom bomb or the hydrogen bomb. That was its purpose.
Wow.
And during that time, I had 2 tours of duty abroad and got on flying status. as a fourth crewman, because as a line crew chief. And so it became a very interesting experience to fly.
Right.
And because I'd never flown except when I left Charlotte, North Carolina to go to basic training.
So that was your first time. Yeah.
Super Constellation out of there. But I really enjoyed my tour of duty. And some of the most interesting experiences were two. One night we were flying out of Pine Castle or an air base, going south onto a barman range, a live barman range, training range. And we dropped our bombs, and we were 42,500 feet at the time when we released the bombs, and then we went further south over the Gulf and into the Atlantic coast, and then flew in between outside Florida and coming in on the West Coast. And the colonel that was flying the commander that night kicked my helmet because I sat down below him on a little stool or a little metal step and said, "Baity, we got smoke on board. You need to pull off your parachute and crawl back through about an 8-foot tunnel. It couldn't accommodate much more than the skinny kid I was at the time.
Sure. And
go into the bomb bay and check to see if you can determine where the fire is." Now, I'm a young man of faith.
Right.
I did a lot of praying as I went back there.
Right.
But the comical part of this story, before I continue, is I just purchased a new 1956 Ford. They tell me that, your life flashes before your eyes before you may experience death. And so as I was crawling back there, it's interesting when you're facing possible death of bailing out at 42,500 feet.
Without a parachute.
Well, I would, I didn't want, about the Ford. One of the thoughts I was contemplating, who's going to drive my new Ford? Because when I bailed out, I was going to end up in the Okefenokee Swamp.
Right.
With a bunch of alligators and snakes. But did a lot of praying, and when I got back there, the colonel cautioned me, don't step on the bomb bay doors without a parachute on.
All right, of which you had you take off already.
So I was praying, and I cut on the bomb bay lights, which is a manual switch, and hung on to a rail that up over the bomb bay doors. And as I went back, I couldn't smell any smoke back there, couldn't see any fire. And the orders were, the standing orders to Strategic Air Command was, if you get fire in the after bomb bay doors, you are to eject. Well, they would eject, I would bail out quite differently.
Right.
And in doing so, I couldn't smell smoke and come back, and I'm praying, don't make me have to jump out, because they say the bombardier would eject straight down, and that's a cannon shot that ejects the bombardier and navigator. The pilot and the commander of the aircraft, they eject the canopy and they shoot straight up in the air. What does little Larry do? I have to drop the staircase that's just out of the bottom and ball up in a chute like this and slide down that chute and hope that I don't break my back on the wheels that they've lowered to slow the aircraft down.
Because you knew where you were going.
I knew where I was going. We were over the swamps at the time, and I was scared to death because this would have been my first time.
How old were you then?
I was 19.
Okay, all right.
Just a fuzzy cheek kid.
Sure.
And at the time, and finally when the colonel says, well, it's still smelling smoke. He said, I hate to destroy a $2 million aircraft. Well, my bomb bay system, or my bomb system, and the radar system was over $1 million too. But he says, I don't want to destroy this aircraft. He says, let's wait it out a little bit longer. and it dissipated. The smoke dissipated. And old Larry was very thankful to the Lord that night that I wasn't going to be eaten by a gator or a snake, because I hate snakes. But anyway, long and short, we brought the aircraft back safely later, about 8 hours later after that flight. And to this day, we went through that aircraft from its nose to its tail and never found what that was.
Never found the smoke.
It was just one of those fluky things. But I'll tell you, I was very thankful to the Lord that I didn't have to bail out that night.
Oh, sure.
Oh, man.
Oh, wow.
That's one of the tales. There's many more, but that's
I don't know if we'd be sitting here talking if you had to do that.
I wouldn't have been here.
Yeah. Well, maybe, the alligators might only eat an arm and a leg. You may have still been here. Wow. What a story. I think what's interesting when I hear stories from our veterans, and we love talking to our folk who have served our nation in so many ways. And I ask about your age because I knew you were young, so you'd be 18, 19. But framing that in the context of age and that experience that you just described, which is, one of fear of life, am I going to make it? Am I not going to make it? But you had to do it. It was responsibility. It was what you had been trained for, but there you were facing it at that young age. Let me ask you, Larry, not to get too philosophical, but from a standpoint of having that experience at that young age in your life, something that's a big experience, right? How do you think that impacted your life?
Greatly.
Yeah. How?
In many ways. I've nearly drowned 3 times my entire lifetime, and I always felt God had a purpose for me, because I'm surprised I'm still living today because of the experiences I've experienced through the grace of God over the years, which happens to be 87 at this point in time. But it changed a lot of me. I was born in this county and raised with a very strict parents. And in doing so, it put me on a path that the experience of having to bail out at that aircraft and other experiences really put me on a more straight line. At the young man, I would grow into a young adult, and then manhood, and then father, and now grandfather, and the great-grandfather.
Right. So are you suggesting that you're a product of the time? So when service to country or service to a difficult situation, it was just part of what you were supposed to do, and it wasn't the idea that it's not like you really had a lot of choices. You were going to do it because it was the right thing to do.
Exactly.
Okay.
Can I share one other experience with you?
Well, I can't imagine how I could stop you.
Well, very talkative, as I said, a little talkative young man, but an old man now. Yeah. But I was working on the flight line one night, and it's about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and it's dark on the runway, and I was working up working on the radar and bomb sight system of the B-47. And I'm looking through the periscope, which is directed out to a tower that we zeroed the scope on. All of a sudden, the lights come on both runways, 2 huge giant runways in Pine Castle. I said, that means somebody's coming in.
Yeah.
And it was silent. And then it's hot. It's in the middle of the summer. And the only thing I could hear was the air blower pushing hot air up into the cockpit. But anyway, there was a black shadow that went across the scope. I said, that's unusual. So I says, curiosity killed the cat, right?
Right.
Well, Larry Baity must have had 9 lives. But anyway, I crawled down out of the staircase and flagged down one of the line trucks. And at the time, I was a buck sergeant rank. And I says, hey, let's go see what that aircraft is, because it didn't taxi back in its direction. It parked out off near the tower on runway 2. So we go jump in this little Chevrolet line truck and go bouncing across runway 1, and then by the time we get to runway 2, or in the middle of the runway 1 and 2, I'm surrounded by air police and dogs. Mm. And I'm standing with my arms stretched up in the air, and both this corporal and I standing there with our arms up, with people shouting at me, telling me to stand very still, handcuff this little boy, and took me to the base AP office, started to interrogate me. Now, I've got some rank,
sure,
but I have a colonel in front of me. And so before the morning's out, I have the first sergeant telling me, Baity, you dress in your Class A's, and you report to Colonel Michael McCoy, the base commander. I figure I'm in deep trouble right now.
Right.
So the real story, niche of the story is when I report, got my hair cut, boots shined so you could shave in them, and I report to duty, and I walk in, and I'm put in front of a major at the entranceway to his office. He says, Baity, have a seat. And I'm sitting there tapping my heel, nervous as a cat on a hot tin roof, I guess. And he says, the colonel will be with you in a minute. Well, that minute ended up being about 45 minutes. Now I'm starting to sweat bullets, right? So I walk in. When I'm announced to walk in, slowly walk slightly, close the door softly, and walk up with about 15 steps in front of the colonel and give him a very sharp salute and report, Airman First Class Baity reporting, sir. And the colonel reminded me of another colonel. It says Strategic Air Command. He always had a cigar out of the corner of his mouth. And he says, be with you in a minute. And he continues shuffling papers. He looks up at me and he says, okay, Airman, what are you doing here? Well, he knew why I was there. He says, what were you doing last night on going across to check our aircraft? And I says, well, curiosity, sir. He says, well, you're in deep doo-doo. He didn't use that word.
Right.
But he says, what you saw you didn't see. He said, why did you want to see that? I said, sir, and I gave him an explanation to shorten the story. And he says, I'm going to have you sign a document. The document says you never saw what you saw. If you ever talk about it for the next 10 years, you'll be incarcerated at Leavenworth for a long tour of duty. Little did I know that was the first experience I ever saw us in a U-2 aircraft. And only when one was shot down over the Soviet Union many years later did I realize that I saw one of the greatest inventions of the United States Air Force was a surveillance U-2 aircraft.
Wow. Well, I'm glad that 10 years has passed. As you were telling that story, I was waiting for the punchline of how long that cone of silence was that you were supposed to be in. So we're clear.
Oh, yes. But it was an earth-shaking experience.
Wow. So you were witnessing history there.
I've often stated to my children and grandchildren and anybody that talks to me, you often experience history in the making, becoming part of history, or making history.
That's right.
Maybe I got a trifecta that night.
Yeah.
I became witnessing history that very few people knew, and became a part of history, and I made history for the family.
Right. That's right. For being so darn curious.
Yeah, but it's been one of my faults. Well, I'm often pushing the limits.
Yeah.
Never tried to break.
Is it a fault, or is it just one of those things that certain people are endowed with this profound curiosity? Because if everyone were as curious at the same level of depth of curiosity, then everybody would, every gathering of people would be this. If you could imagine being in a room with 10 Larry Baities, of where everybody's got these profound stories to share. So not everybody's supposed to do that. So some are supposed to be the curious ones, and they share all the stories because they find them all. They see all these things happen, and they entertain everybody else.
Well, I've often been told that curiosity is the answer to questions.
Yes.
And, it can be hazardous to your own well-being
Right,
sometimes,
right.
but the long and short is, it's been maybe one of my little faults in life,
Yeah.
but it's also revealed a great revelation to me as I grew through my younger years and through all these years that God gave me to live this longevity.
Having gotten to know you as we have, I can attest to the fact that with your plethora of experiences, and this is one like 3 pages and thousands of pages of a life's book, but it's kept you not just keeping you alive. A lot of things keep us alive, a lot of purposes.
Yeah.
But keeping your mind sharp, keeping you active, keeping you in the conversation, if you will, as a participant and as leading a conversation. That happens when people have lived an extraordinary life.
I think so, because if you stop learning or experiencing things, you become a very dull person, and you don't live your life that God gave you to live.
Right.
Or at least that's my feeling about it.
I wanted us to talk today about a part of your memory that I'd read about, and that was around the North Wilkesboro Motor Speedway. And of course, it's going through a rebirth now, and it has sat still for a while, and for several years, and now it's officially opening again. It's opened already, had races. Now the track's being freshened up. But I want us to go back in time, because you have very early memories and experiences at that track, right?
Very much so.
What's your first memory of the racetrack?
Was a day of the race itself. A little backdrop to it was
Well, which race?
the May the 5th, 1947.
The very first
First
race?
race.
Okay, all right.
My uncle was a gentleman by the name of Richard Smithy. Everybody called him Rich.
Uh-huh.
And he and Enoch Staley, who formed the first racetrack here, one of the principal owners, were boyhood friends.
Okay.
And as a story told was that Enoch went to South Carolina to a race down there, and I believe it was 1945. And he was so impressed with the turnout of the crowd that, being the entrepreneur that he would become,
Right.
saw these large crowds, and he visioned, well, why not? Because Wilkes County was known for moonshine, the biggest cash crop of the county in those days, the 30s and 40s and early
Right.
50s. Moonshine was the deal. So he came back, and with a couple of Combs brothers and another gentleman, formed the first racetrack, or built the first racetrack with $1,500.
Yeah. But they had also gotten, if I remember the story right too, you might speak to it, they didn't just come back and do it, but they had talked to France in South Carolina and said, will you help?
Yes. They wanted him to help produce or
Right.
form the first race. But the reason I got to attend the race was that Rich and Enoch were great friends, boyhood friends, and remained so. And they used to go to the same barbershop down on Main Street in Old Wilkesboro. I think it was called City Barbershop.
And that's why you go to the barbershop, relationships, right?
Yeah.
Get your
But
hair
anyway, it seems that prior to the first race being run, Enoch left, ran into Rich when they were getting their hair cut. And he says, Rich, would you like to come to the race at my new track? And Rich had told him, this is early May. And he said, yes, sir. And he said, well, I'll leave you 2 tickets. So when Rich went back and got his tickets, he came to my mother and father and says, can I take Larry to the race. Now, I was only 12 years old, still fuzzy-haired little boy. Never been to a racetrack in my life. So when we arrived that morning, Rich says, now, it's supposed to be maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people show up. We're going to get a good parking spot. Mm-hmm. So he got a parking spot, and we went in, and he seemed to know everybody.
Right.
And the track was a dirt track. And it was a modified races in those days. NASCAR wasn't formed yet.
Right.
And long and short of this story was that the Flock brothers showed up. There's 3 Flock brothers and the sister. And but anyway, back to the story. Was that Rich says, well, we need to get a hot dog and a Coke before the race starts because I don't know how many people's going to be here. Well, ended up over 10,000 people showed up for the race.
Wow.
It shocked everybody, but you see, most of the drivers were moonshine drivers through the back roads of Wilkes County and the mountains of Blue Ridge and Brushy Mountains. And most of those people in the stands either built the engines or knew the drivers. And so it became a point of interest that started NASCAR. It became one of the early tracks, short tracks of NASCAR. Mm-hmm. It also put this young kid of 12 years old on the track to racing. Different story.
Right.
But anyway, I need a need for speed, shall I say.
Right.
But it became an experience that became part of my makeup as a young man and into my adulthood. It's about racing.
What all do you remember about that? I mean, I obviously remembered you got a hot dog and you remember 10,000 people, but talk about that first moment when the cars start up and they start. I mean, what was going through your mind?
It was a unique experience because I always loved the old Fords if they had a 3/4 Escadarian racing cam into that loping engine. But here they were wide open.
Right.
In those days, they used little coupes.
So was that the first race you had ever seen?
Ever seen.
So you hadn't seen a drag? You hadn't seen anything before racing?
There wasn't no drag racing as a consequence in those days. This was before that era.
Okay.
Which I did become part of that era. But anyway, as the racing started, the roar of the engines I pepped up real quick. Now, I was standing up on a hill because there weren't any stands like you see today in most tracks. It's like benches that Enoch and his crew had lined up, and the track really wasn't completed, per se. But then as a race, they run heats in those days. Mm-hmm. And there was a driver by the name of Fonty Flock, unusual name. And I talked earlier about he and his brothers and his sister racing. And is this modified? And he won all 5 heats, which gave him the pole position in the main race. And he actually won the first race at North Wilkesboro. I got to meet him.
Wow.
And his brothers and some other racing who went on to famous.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
They became very well known.
Oh, yeah.
Did his sister race during that on that day? Because I knew she was there, right?
Yeah, I didn't see her.
Okay.
But the brothers were.
Right.
And Bob and one of the other brothers was there. But Lee Petty was there, and different people that went on to fame and fortune, shall I say. But I found it interesting that NASCAR became a major sport in this country. I grew up with football and baseball and basketball, but racing became part of my makeup. I was often accused of I would go to see 2 baby buggies race, and I guess that's true. But racing was done through the mountains of North Carolina, and I think most of the early NASCAR drivers were moonshine drivers, shall I say. And they learned to run the roads of the hairpin curves of the brushes and the Blue Ridge Mountains.
They had plenty of practice.
Oh, yeah. So they became natural. and changed the car industry to a great extent because the NASCAR created a different world to the automobile industry.
Right, right. So that was your first race there. You were the very first one at that track. Did you go back to see more?
Yes.
Yeah.
But a little side trip of that, I got to see the last race on the sand at Daytona in 1957. Cotton Owens won it in a Pontiac of all cars. But I've been in certain circumstances being like we talked about history.
So you were. So let me. So did I understand right? So you were at the very first race at the track in North Wilkesboro, the North Wilkesboro Speedway, the very first one.
Yes.
And then in Florida, you participated in another piece of history, and being at the very last race,
where they raced on the sand and the blacktop, as before they built the huge NASCAR track that they race on now
in Daytona. Right.
Yeah.
Did that dawn upon you what was happening? When you were there, were you? How old were you at that time? Because you were younger then too. So
I would have been between 20 and 21 years old.
So is that expression a need for speed? Is it truly that, a need for it? So once you do it and you get it in your system, do you really need to do that?
I think so, because as I've grown older, I've become more cautious. But as a young fella, growing up in this part of the country with fast forwards, and it became part of my makeup, you know, and I always loved beautiful women and cars.
Right.
But Fords were the car of the day, and I drove Fords most of my life because they seemed to be ahead of the industry at the time. That caught up with Chevrolet in the 55s. But as an individual, racing become very much part of my lifestyle and in my family.
Right. Okay, so just to clarify one point, so you did race, do a sanctioned race in Kissimmee, and you didn't win the first one, but as time went on, you continued to race, and then you did win?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, talk about that.
Okay.
Your first win. That first win, what was that like when you?
Well, it's a unique experience, I think, because winning is what you do.
Right.
You want to achieve that. You want to go for the brass ring. In doing so, it becomes a goal that you want. Every time you set the starting line, you want to win. Or if it's in an oval race, you always want to be leading the pack, especially at the end of the race.
Right.
But that first race, it set the adrenaline on a track that's hard to achieve every time you do it. In 1957, the first time I got my 57 Ford, it had 2 4-barrel carburetors on it and a racing cam and everything. And there was a young fellow by the name of Blair out of side Orlando, had a new 57 Chevrolet Bel Air fuel injection. And he became my nemesis. And it seemed like we would end up as in the sequence of the racing to get you to race for the day. Either he would win or I would win, but we were usually just bumpers ahead or behind each other. But I'll never forget this guy. He was a mechanic, stripped down Bel Air Chevrolet. Mine was a big 57 Ford Fairlane 500. Much more the difference in the weight. But it put me on a path, and coming back to North Wilkesboro, I must tell you this story. By twist of irony, as I stated, I've always ended up, for some reason or other, being when history's being made. By coincidence, I returned back to Wilkes County after about 66 years when my wife passed away, and I returned here and live out my years. And my cousin from Orlando was up visiting, and And I says, would you like to go by the old North Wilkesboro Speedway? Lo and behold, that was the day that the announcement was that they were going to rejuvenate the racetrack.
Wow.
And one of the state congressmen from Wilkes County was there that was instrumental into getting the funding and so forth for the race. I got to witness the return of racing to Wilkesboro now. I thought this was unusual. I'm probably the only one of the few cats still living that would witness the beginning of racing in Wilkes County and witness the return after all these years. I enjoy racing. Like I say, it's part of my makeup now.
It's part of the Larry Baity story, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Well, look, you've got all these incredible memories, and you've been part of a lot of history. We're going to wrap up with just this one notion. So your family has gone along with you on this journey. Your boys have developed an appreciation. They also serve, right?
Oh,
so
yes.
you have Air Force sons.
Well, I have my oldest grandson is a major Marine aviator.
Right.
Flies a Cobra gunship, the big helicopter.
Right.
He also is a flight instructor for the Cobras with the Marine Corps. His father is got wings as a civilian, fixed wing wings, and also a hot air balloonist.
Right.
And my oldest grandson's brother's a police officer in Dothan. Also just been approved to become a Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms federal agent. And my number 2 son's a nuclear engineer. And number 3 son's an attorney down in Nashville, Tennessee. And my number 1 son lives in Mooresville, is a tool engineer, or not an engineer, but a machinist.
Right.
And the youngest young boy is back in Nashville. And but we love flight, and we love fast cars and fast aircraft.
That's exciting. Larry Baity, it's always good to sit and chat with you. I seldom, well, no, it's not true. I've often said with people that, hey, this story is certainly not over. So I have said that before, but not that often, because usually we can kind of wrap a story up in a nice session. Sometimes they're long sessions, but your life is a little different. I think we'll visit several times because you have several parts of your life that are very different. So I look forward to visiting with you in the future and hearing more of your stories. And thanks a lot for sharing about your love for speed and that interesting piece of history, that not many people are able to share that today.
Thank you first of all for inviting me to be your guest. It's been an enjoyable experience for me. But yeah, I've been blessed, shall I say, with a lot of unique experiences as a young kid growing up in Wilkes County, and I'd invite anyone who's from this part of the world or comes into this part of the world to come and visit a very historical part of Carolina. It's one of God's great little green spots on the face of this earth.
Right.
But Wilkes County is very unique in its people. It's very friendly. People here, you walk up and people will start talking to you, as I would, without even knowing you and inviting you. But I'd welcome you to come and visit us here in the mountains of North Carolina. Great place. Thank you for having me.
Great place and good people.
Yes, sir.
That's it. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for listening to the Life in the Carolinas podcast. If you enjoyed your time with us, please visit the show's website at lifeinthecarolinas.com. Join our mailing list, and we'll keep you updated every week on what we have coming up and other interesting things around the Carolinas. We value you as a podcast subscriber. We'll see you next week. And remember what Carl says, it's never a bad time for a good story.